Hey, hockey fans, welcome to the Across the Pond Hockey Podcast YouTube channel. If it's your first time here and you'd like to support us, please hit that subscribe button and that like button. It goes a long way in helping us develop the program. Before we get to tonight's episode, I have to take a minute to thank our wonderful sponsors, starting with the China Hockey Group. The China Hockey Group is a family-oriented group of ice hockey leagues, training programs, and community initiatives geared towards developing hockey in Southeast Asia. From their incredible Junior Tigers program all the way up to the CIHL, which is Hong Kong's elite full-contact ice hockey league, they have a program suitable for players of all ages and abilities. You can also stop by the Warrior Bauer Hockey Shop in Central for all your equipment needs and skate sharpening. Check out their website for more information at ChinaHockeyGroup.com. That's ChinaHockeyGroup.com. Next, we have our friends at Accessory House Global. If you're like me and your headphones look like this, it's time to head to AccessoryHouseGlobal.com for any accessories you need for your headphones. From cables to carrying cases to new ear pads, they carry products for all the biggest brands. Head to their website at AccessoryHouseGlobal.com. Use the promo code ATP20 for 20% off your purchase. That's AccessoryHouseGlobal.com. Next, we have our pals over at Wheel Hub Asia. These guys are committed to building community and bringing accessibility to inline hockey players across Southeast Asia. They're heading into the year 2 of Hong Kong's newest inline league, 3 Inline. You can head to their website for all of your inline hockey needs at wheelhubasia.com. Enter discount code ATP10 for 10% off your purchase. That's wheelhubasia.com. Next, we have our friends at Yardley Brothers Craft Brewery. Folks, if you're a craft brew fan and you're in Hong Kong, then you absolutely have to check out Yardley Brothers' incredible selection of award-winning brews. You can head to the Beer Shack on Llama Island or the Yardley Brothers Cafe and Bistro at 62 Peel Street in Central. If you can't get out of the house, no problem. Just head to their website, yardleybrothers.hk, and you can get their delicious products delivered right to your door. That's yardleybrothers.hk. Last but not least, a huge thank you to Mr. Paul McLean at Sunset Studio in Kennedy Town for always making the podcast sound great. If you're looking for a place to jam with your band or record a new song, check them out on Instagram at sunset_studio_HK. That's sunset_studio_HK. Folks, the websites and description will be in the description. All the discount codes will be there for you. Please check them out and support our wonderful sponsors. Hey, hockey fans, welcome to Across the Pond Hockey Talks Volume 57. I have with me here tonight my only reoccurring guest on the show. He's been coming and going for the last 4 seasons, talking to us about classic hockey movies. We've gotten into hockey music, and sometimes he just likes to stop by and drop some history on us. And that's what we're in for in this episode. I have with me today the pride of PEI, Mr. Terry Whelan. How are you tonight, Ter?
I'm great. Great, Chris. Great to be back. And an interesting one tonight, eh?
Well, we get to show your pretty face tonight, which is good for everyone. So
I told you the first time we did this, lad, a great face for radio.
You certainly did. I do remember that well. And so those of you who are just listening, the podcast is now available on YouTube. And this is the first episode with Terry. So Terry, a bit of sad news to start off tonight's podcast with the passing of the king, the great Boreas Salming. He was my dad's favorite player. I guess he's a lot of guys' favorite players. He just seems like one of those guys. Tell me a little bit about what you know and what you remember about Mr. Salming.
Again, when I think Boreas Salming, he was a package deal. The guy that is of course was very few were as talented as Boreas Salming, but he came across with Inge Hammerstrom, who lasted 4 or 5 seasons with the Leafs. I think he lasted 6 years altogether. I think he had a year in St. Louis after that. And I remember vividly the two of them coming over. And the thing, they didn't receive a welcome with open arms.
No, they were pioneers, right?
They were pioneers. And again, it was chicken Swede. was the derogatory phrase I think most commonly used.
Yeah.
And the toughness that man, both of them, but Salming in particular showed. He came in 73. I think I read his second game. He was fighting with Dave Schultz.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, this is the Flyers. So
Mhm.
that'll give you an idea of the era. And he dropped in that from coming over from Europe, and of course a trailblazer.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
sad time in Leafs Nation right now. It was really touching to see that he was able to get, that last ceremony in with his boys, and he had a big smile on his face, and special moment. So for tonight's episode, Terry, we're going to go back and look at some other special moments, maybe the most recent special moment in Leafs history. The 1967 Toronto Maple Leafs. I'm going to set the stage here for you, but before we do, why don't you just start with a quick history about the Leafs before we get going?
Sure, Chris. And you cannot talk about the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs Hockey Club. I mean, it starts with one man, and that's Conn Smythe. Mm-hmm. So prior to purchasing the club in 1927, thus saving it from a move to Philadelphia, the team that began when the NHL began in 1917 was first called the Toronto Arenas. They won a Stanley Cup in 1918. Then there were the Toronto St. Patrick's, who won a Stanley Cup in 1922. Smythe changed the name to Maple Leafs, the colors to blue and white, and in 1931 opened the iconic Maple Leaf Gardens at the corner of Carlton and Church Streets in Toronto. The team won 8 Stanley Cups with Smythe as the owner. He would eventually cede control to his son, Stafford Smythe, in 1961.
Now, Terry, Conn Smythe himself, pretty complicated man. Seems like he left a very complicated legacy behind.
That he did, Chris. And he was a self-made man, earning his fortune in the sand and gravel business. During the First World War, he was awarded the Military Cross for bravery at Ypres. During the Second World War, he would again volunteer for service, be wounded in France at the age of 45. He was a big contributor to veterans and children's charities and was integral to the success of the NHL, making the Maple Leafs the cornerstone franchise of English Canada. He helped oversee construction of the Hockey Hall of Fame, to which he was elected as a builder in 1958, and the league recognized his contributions to the game by naming the trophy given to the playoff MVP after him in 1965. However, he was a union buster who ran Leafs captain Jimmy Thompson out of town for helping Ted Lindsay's doomed attempt to organize NHL players in the 1950s. He was an anti-Semite, and we saw both of those qualities when we talked about the movie Net Worth.
That's right.
Yeah, perhaps most egregious was his treatment of Herb Carnegie, a Toronto native who always wanted to play for the Maple Leafs. That dream was effectively destroyed when Smythe said of the 3-time Quebec League MVP that he would give any person $10,000 if they could turn Herb Carnegie white. The NHL would be the last of the major North League sports leagues to integrate when Willie O'Ree played for the Bruins in 1958. And now, Chris, in the NHL's defense, they have tried to right this wrong. Earlier this month, the Hall of Fame welcomed the class of 2022. Players Roberto Luongo, Daniel Alfredson, Daniel and Henrik Sedin, and Riikka Salonen were joined by one new member in the builder category, and that was Herb Carnegie. So again, nice to see the NHL again continuing to try to look at its past and make it right. But we could still ask the question, Chris, that could we rename that trophy?
Well, Terry, it wouldn't surprise me if a push came for that to happen, knowing what we know about, like you said, about Conn Smythe. And now knowing, I mean, I don't know a lot about Herb Carnegie, but now that I do, I think it would be important to look into it. I mean, why not? The way things are changing now and doing the right thing seems to be on the rise.
Yeah. What I never understood was, again, naming it after Norris. It's like the Norris Trophy is named after James Norris.
Right.
It just seems sort of a no-brainer that, the Norris Trophy, I'd say the Doug Harvey, but I understand the Bobby Orr. Right. And I mean, Jean Beliveau just seems like a natural. He was the first winner of the Conn Smythe.
Right.
And it was just no one remembers Conn Smythe. You didn't grow up with a picture of him on your wall.
Yeah, totally agree, Terry. I mean, and it could happen. I mean, as we try to right some of the wrongs of the past,
Right.
if we look back at some of these, and I mean, thank you for pointing this out to us. I mean, the amount of research and the amount of work that you put into these is incredible. Just so people know, these shows are written and they're well written.
Yeah, this isn't off the top of my head. That's for sure.
No, that's right. So Terry, back to Conn Smythe. He owns the Leafs until 61. And his sale of the team would coincide with the very final Leafs dynasty.
That's correct. And in 1961, Smythe sold his majority interest in the team to his son, Stafford Smythe. Unbeknownst to Conn, Stafford had two partners in the deal, John Bassett and Harold Ballard. The new blood would thrive early on, winning the team's first cup since 1951 in 1962, and another two cups back-to-back in 63-64 to complete a three-peat. In these teams, we see what will become the core of that final cup-winning team of 66-67. A total of 11 players from the 1967 team played on the three other Stanley Cup winning teams. A mix of savvy veterans, mostly from the Red Wings, and products of their terrific farm system, which included St. Michael's College and the Toronto Marlies. They'd be added to the mix to win that final cup in 1967.
Yeah.
10 players from that team would go on to the Hall of Fame, and they remain one of the oldest teams to win the cup.
All right, so that's about the players. So how about the coach, Terry? Who was behind the bench at that time?
Yeah, that was George Punch Imlach. And he came on board as coach GM in 1958.
Great
Now,
name.
Imlach, Punch was divisive. Older players tended to love him. And the younger guys, they hated his dictatorial, heavy emphasis on practice ways. But make no mistake, the Leafs don't have this period of success without Punch Imlach. Now, that being said, his inability to adapt to the times would help tear the 67 champs down. And he was fired in 1969, leaving to run the expansion Buffalo Sabres from 1970 to 75 before a disastrous return as GM under Harold Ballard in 1979. That would again set the franchise back for years. Maybe, Chris, a loose equivalent to Imlach as coach would be John Tortorella, who is back in the NHL this year with the Philadelphia Flyers. So a question to you, will the tough taskmaster coach, will that ever go out of style?
It seems to have already gone out of style. The only guy left is Torts. And he keeps getting chances because, he's one of those guys, you either love him or you hate him, but he gets a lot out of his teams for a short period of time. So he's been able to turn around some franchises, get teams in the playoffs that weren't supposed to be there. He seems to get every ounce out of every player. And the guys that aren't on the bench that night, there's a reason. He's not afraid to keep guys out of the lineup. He really runs a tight ship. He seems, it seems like a match made in heaven to have him in Philadelphia right now. And they got off to a pretty quick start. They're a team that's not very talented. They have a bunch of injuries, and he's struggling. And he got kicked in the face by a horse a couple weeks ago. So old Torts is having a rough time with the Broad Street Bullies. But I do think it's gone out of style. But Torts seems to still make it work.
I think you brought up a good point that these guys they don't get the long leash. You don't see them for decades anymore. Punch Imlach for 14, 15 years in Toronto. Jack Adams for a generation in Detroit, right? They maybe there's still maybe with the modern guys, it's as you say, maybe more of a quick fix, but it wears out its welcome a little faster these days.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
All right. So enough about Philly and Torts. Let's get back to the Leafs here. Let's set the stage, Terry. How did the regular season go? The 66-67 regular season. How did that play out?
Yeah, now it was the 50th season of the National Hockey League. It opened October 19, 1966. The Chicago Blackhawks dominated the 70-game regular season, finishing first for the first time in franchise history. Their 94 points were 17 ahead of second place Montreal. That Hawks team was stacked. They scored a league record 264 goals. To compare, Chris, last season, 21 teams had less goals than that in the
Wow.
NHL
And how many games?
12 more games.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, in
Wow.
70. Bobby Hull had 52. That was the third time he went over 50. Only two others, Maurice Rocket Richard and Bernie Boom Boom Geoffrion, had gone over 50 once. Stan Mikita won the Art Ross, the Lady Byng, and the Hart trophies. He remains the only player ever to win those three awards in a single season, and he would do it again the next year. On the back end, the Hawks had Hall of Fame defenseman Pierre Pilote and the Vezina winning goalie tandem of Dennis Giorgi and Glenn Hall. So after the Habs, the Leafs finished third, surviving a team record 10-game losing streak in January, February, and the Rangers fourth behind the Norris Trophy winning play of Harry Howell and all-star goalie Eddie Jokinen. The Red Wings, far removed from their 50s dynasty, finished out of the playoffs, and the Bruins missed the playoffs for the 8th straight year.
Ooh.
But hope sprang eternal. Bobby Orr won the Calder Trophy that year and would win the next 8 Norris. In the playoffs, Montreal beat New York 4 straight. They finished on April 13th, 1967, and awaited the winner of the Chicago-Toronto semifinal.
Okay, so if Chicago finished first, why did they play the third place Toronto Maple Leafs in the semis?
Because one played 3 and 2 played 4.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Well, this was the format since 42-43 when the original 6 started, and it continued after expansion. Okay. In 1970-71, the North Stars lost their last 4 regular season games, thus finishing 4th and making the third place Flyers play the first place Blackhawks, who swept them while the Stars would beat the second place Blues. So the league changed the format after the following season. Does it make any sense, though, Chris, to have
I'm still confused. No, it doesn't. I'm trying to think of another situation where we might see that. No, it doesn't make sense.
No. Yes. And it took some pretty overt tanking at the end of the regular season to make, a long overdue change.
Right.
Because
so teams wanting to finish 4th so that they could play the second place team.
Of course, And it again, just one of those historical anomalies, I guess.
Yeah, strange one. Glad they made that change. All right, so let's take a look at that semifinal series versus Chicago.
Yeah, so the series opened with Game 1, April 6th at Chicago Stadium, aka the Madhouse on Madison, and it went according to script, with the high-powered Hawks cruising past the Leafs 5-2. Frank Mahovlich had the first Leafs goal. The Big M was 29 years old. The product of St. Michael's College, won the Calder Trophy in 1958, was a 9-time All-Star, won 6 cups, played for Team Canada in 1972. He was elected to the Hall of Fame in 1981 and would later serve in the Canadian Senate. Adding an assist on the second Leafs goal was Tim Horton. At 37, the career Leaf, another St. Mike's product, had been a steady presence on their blue line since 1952. The 6-time All-Star, long known for being the strongest player in the NHL, was killed in a single vehicle accident while driving drunk at the age of 44 in 1974 while playing for the Buffalo Sabres. Elected to the Hall of Fame in 1977, he lives on as the namesake of the now worldwide donut chain, the first of which he opened in Hamilton in 1964. Now, Chris, I certainly don't expect you to know every name. We'll be giving a little shout out to all the guys who got their name on the cup in this episode, but there's a couple of big ones there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Tim Horton is a legend especially in Canada. And we're still drinking his coffee all around the world, like you said.
I think a good point, Chris, is because the name has become so ubiquitous and synonymous with coffee, people tend to forget
that what a giant,
a giant of the game. He still the Leafs career team leader in plus minus, still top 5 in games and in penalty minutes.
Wow. And he didn't play
Yeah.
that many. How many seasons did he play?
Oh no, he was there for a while.
He was there for a
He
while.
got his
Okay.
20 in. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, and of course Frank Mahovlich, like you said, maybe one of the toughest guys to ever play the game.
Yeah. Again, with his time in Toronto, he, as we'll see, was one of these guys that just Punch Imlach just took a dislike to. Frank Mahovlich actually ahead of his time in one sense. He had very public for the time struggles with depression,
Okay.
with the stress and the pressure, and Punch Imlach, did not treat it kindly. The Leaf fans ragged on him, and I think Mahovlich, the back end of his career when he was traded to Montreal, where he picked up another couple of cups, played with his younger brother Peter. I think he enjoyed those years.
Right.
Much more away from the crucible that it still is playing in Toronto.
Right. And I know you mentioned Tim Horton was recognized as one of the toughest guys, but Frank Mahovlich was no slouch and he was a big man,
Oh, of
correct?
course.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was a big man. He was
Yeah.
a big man.
Big
Yeah.
man. Yeah.
Now, game 2 was April 9th. On
Okay.
the 2 nights between games, Chicago Stadium played host to an ice show. That, combined with some warm spring weather, turned the ice to slush, slowing down the Speedy Hawks and allowing the Leafs to grind out a 3-1 win. Dave Keon scored the game winner, assisted by George Chief Armstrong. In 2016, the Toronto Maple Leafs named Dave Keon the greatest Leaf ever. The St. Mike's product was 26 in 1967, with a Calder, 2 Lady Bings, and 3 Stanley Cup championships already to his credit. A great two-way player who's still the franchise leader in shorthanded goals, his eventual estrangement from the team would become indicative of how badly the Leafs fumbled their future. Keon would enter the Hall of Fame in 1986. George Armstrong was captain of the Leafs for 13 years from 1958 to 1971. The Toronto Maple Leafs product was 36 in 1967, still holds the team records both for games played and for points by a right winger. With an Irish father and an Anishinaabe mother, he was the first player of Indigenous descent to score an NHL goal. The humble, classy leader would be elected to the Hall of Fame in 1975. So another couple of giants there, Chris. And I'm going to ask you.
There's so many.
And there is indeed. And I'm going to ask your opinion now.
Yeah.
Who's the greatest Leaf ever, or the best one that you've seen?
Well, if I look back in history, I mean, I have to agree with most people when they say Borje Salming, Daryl Sittler. I personally grew up in the era of Matt Sundin, Wendell Clark, Dougie Gilmour. For me, I think in my generation, since I've been watching hockey, I think it has to be Matt Sundin. And what I've heard about him from other players, a consummate professional, quiet, humble man who worked his tail off. Just seemed like a really, really quality guy and a really quality leader. But I mean, I obviously there's so much history to the Leafs before my time. So if I threw that right back at you, who would come to mind for you right away?
I think again, here's the stat you got to know. Yeah. Only one Toronto Maple Leaf has ever won the Conn Smythe Trophy for playoff MVP, and that was Dave Keon.
Right.
So until another Leaf wins the Conn Smythe, unless it's a one-off like one hit wonder Tim Thomas or Cam Ward, someone who comes out of nowhere. I mean, it has to be Keon. I mean, the name of the game is winning the whole thing.
I like that. I mean, I like that you said that instead of saying like someone who wins a Hart or wins a scoring race or something, because that may happen. Austin Matthews scores a few goals.
Yeah. Well, and again, Austin Matthews now, he's still got a way to go to catch Rick Vaive.
Yeah.
He's still, that young whippersnapper. He needs another 2 seasons over 50 to take the team record from Ricky Vaive.
Yeah.
Who, again, shout out from PEI to, I think, the Leaf I enjoyed the most.
Quick interjection here before we move on. Mr. Paul McLean, our head honcho at Sunset Studio, has chosen the Leafs to win the cup this year because
Uh-huh.
Austin Matthews threw out the first pitch at a Blue Jays game and completely jinxed the rest of their season. So he thinks it's gonna turn things around for the Leafs.
We'll be talking about curses and mojo a little later on.
Yeah, all right.
He could have a point.
He
Yeah,
might. And Paul
he might.
seldom wrong. He's seldom wrong.
The series, the series,
game three,
it
game
goes,
three.
game three. So it shifts back to Toronto for game three.
Yeah.
Now, George Armstrong was out after a hard hit from Bobby Hull in game two, but
Mhm.
Terry Sawchuk was impressive in a 3-1 win, losing his shutout bid with 4 minutes to go. The first Leafs goal, Ron Ellis from Red Kelly and Larry Jeffrey, that was a snapshot of this team. Young, homegrown talent on the rise, aging veteran looking for another shot at glory, and a capable role player brought in via trade. Ron Ellis was 22. The former Toronto Marois played for the Leafs from 1964 to 1981 and played for Team Canada in 72. He's still top 5 for the team in games played and goals scored. Leonard Red Kelly was 39. He went to St. Mike's College, but the Leafs passed on him, and he began his career as a defenseman in Detroit in 1947. He would win 4 cups and the first Norris Trophy in his 11 years there, before a trade to Toronto and a switch to forward brought him another 4 cups in 8 years. He would win the Lady Byng Trophy 4 times along the way as well. He'd retire in after the 1967 Cup win to coach the expansion LA Kings. He'd later coached the Leafs from 73 to 77, and he was nominated to the Hall of Fame in 1969. One of those players whose resume was such that they waived the 3-year waiting period. Okay. Larry Jeffrey, his assist would be his only point of the playoffs. He hurt his knee in Game 6 against Chicago. The 26-year-old had come over from Detroit in 65 and would see his career end in 69 from knee problems. I think he had a total of 9 surgeries. So some things don't change, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. That's pretty much the same makeup of the champion today, though, Chris.
It seems
young
to be
guys,
the story.
Old guys, yeah.
It seems to be pretty common, Terry. But I mean, there's been some anomalies, of course, but it always comes down to the team that has a great mix of veterans and youth and hard work, and guys who are just going to go to war, guys that'll skate through the wall. Guys are going to play through injuries.
Right.
There's this factor. I mean, it happens every year. There's this factor that you can't really see it. You can't really judge it. But at the end, when you hear a story about a guy who played with, a banged up hip and a torn left knee and a broken thumb, you're like, okay, well, it makes sense now. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think maybe there's maybe more emphasis now on the deadline deal.
Oh yeah,
right.
Big time.
Yeah,
I mean, teams are looking for it now.
Right.
Waiting for
this year in the NFL, they had the busiest trade line ever, and I think they had 8 deals.
I know, it's crazy.
Right? Whereas in hockey, teams tend to load up. A quick note about Red Kelly: those 8 cups are the most by a player who was never a Montreal Canadien.
Oh, good stat, Terry, and thanks.
There you go.
For thinking of my Habs.
Yeah, and one other thing that truly, again, when I do this, there's always something I come up with that again is more amazing than the rest of it. I learned that along with playing for the Leafs in the 60s, Red Kelly was the Liberal MP for York West from 1962 to 1965.
Wow.
So while he was playing for the Leafs, he was member of Parliament.
Oh my God.
He beat Alan Eagleson for the seat in 1963.
That is hilarious.
I mean, so hockey was his day job, or I mean, being a member of Parliament was his
day job. That's hilarious.
Yeah, you just again, you're not going to see that today.
No, guys can't even get out of their own way outside of the rink. No, they're not working a second job. I can guarantee you that.
let alone in the House of Parliament.
Imagine. Yeah. Can't even imagine. All right, that's the end. So, Game 3. What happens in Game 4?
That's it. The Hawks rebound with a 4-3 win in game. With a 4-3 win, Game 4. Kenny Warham scored for Chicago just 9 seconds in, and they never trailed. Tim Horton had his nose broken by an Aaron Dennis Hull stick, but he never missed a shift.
Of course he did.
Still, the Leafs, of course not. Still, the Leafs felt good with the series tied 2-2 after 4 games, and the youngsters continued to contribute. Brian Conacher had an assist on the first Leafs goal, and Mike Walton scored the second. Brian Conacher was 25. He'd played for the Canadian Olympic team in 1964. He would finish third in Calder voting that year, behind Ed Van Impe and the aforementioned Bobby Orr. The former Toronto Marlies star was the son of Lionel Big Train Conacher, who was in the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1994, and was also voted Canadian Athlete of the First Half Century, and nephew to Roy and Charlie Conacher, both Stanley Cup champions and Hockey Hall of Famers. Mike Walton was only 22. He had played with the Neil McNeil Maroons of Toronto, the Marlboros, and St. Michael's College. His trade to Boston would be another example of fading Leafs' fortunes. He would pick up 2 more cups with the Bruins and would win the Bill Hunter Trophy as top scorer with the Minnesota Fighting Saints of the WHA in 1974. Now, Chris, the Conachers, as we saw, were generational. Now, you're old enough to have an answer now for this. Who's the best father-son combination that you've seen play in the NHL?
Oh my gosh, the best father-son combo. So there's been some good ones in this generation.
Right.
The
Of
first two
course.
the first that comes to mind is the Kachucks. And now they've got father sons.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's multiple. I mean, that's quite a story.
Yeah.
The Sutters and of course the Domies. You got Ty and Max.
Yeah.
They're the first
nice.
two that come to mind when I think of the best that I've seen. I know there've been quite a few.
Sure.
But are you? Where would you go?
I'm old enough to remember Bobby Hull.
Okay, Bobby and Brett, obviously.
Bobby and Brett, right?
Bobby and Brett,
right? So,
yes. I did a quick search on father-son duos, and one of the first ones that comes up is the Apps. So, Sil App and Sil Jr.
Yes.
That's a little bit even before your time, Terry, I believe.
Indeed. Yeah. That's right. We'd have to ask your dad.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll have to ask my dad. We'll bring him in, special guest. Yeah. So game 5 in Chicago was the Sawchuck. The game we talked about when we talked about the movie Goalie. Terry, tell us about game 5.
That's right. Yeah, game 5 in Chicago. Punch Imlach went with Bauer after Sawchuck was shaky in game 4. Bauer proceeded to let in 2 goals on 12 shots. Sawchuck started the second, and after surviving being knocked off his feet by a Bobby Hull slap shot, made 37 saves for a 4-2 win. The 2 old goalies, Bauer was 42, Sawchuck was 37. They carried the Leafs through the playoffs, but it took 5 goalies, Gary Smith, Al Smith, and Bruce Gamble. They all made appearances to get the Leafs through the regular season. Now, we talked about Terry Sawchuck last time, of course, but just another quick note again, Johnny Bauer, universally beloved, perhaps the most the most favored of the old timey Leafs, right, on this team. The China Wall won 4 cups, 2 Vezinas in his 12 years in Toronto, and had his number 1 retired by the teams. The teams went back to Maple Leaf Gardens, and on April 18th, Toronto eliminated Chicago by a score of 3-1, behind 2 more goals from Brian Conacher and an assist from Alan Stanley, one of his 2 playoff points. Alan Stanley was 40 that year, wrapping up a Hall of Fame career that began with the Rangers in 1948. He was called Snowshoes for his ponderous skating style and was a defensive defenseman who played opposite Tim Horton.
Yeah.
From Timmins, he was a childhood friend of Bill Barilko and was supposed to be on that fishing trip.
Oh, no.
He was one of the pallbearers after Barilko's body was discovered. And in an unrelated, tragically hit note, Stanley made his off-season home in Bob Cajun and ran a hockey school there for many years after his retirement.
I love this.
So the Leafs were able to shut down, or at least contain, Bobby Hull and Stan Mikita. And though the Blackhawks would continue to be a force to be reckoned with through the early 70s, they would never break through to win a championship. The Stanley Cup Finals would open 2 nights later, on April 20th, 1967, in Montreal. So the Leafs, Chris, they're halfway home. And, it's a sprint compared to today's marathon, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we talk about just some great facts about the tragically hip there, Everyone, including you, like knows how much I love Gord and the hip, and it's just so cool to
Yeah.
hear these tiny little connections.
Yeah, even better than the fact the man was known as Snowshoes.
I mean, that's icing on the cake right there. That's just the icing, bud. Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, back to your question. Totally, more of a sprint back then. Obviously, less games, shorter grind, but doesn't seem like it was much easier. I mean, the game, because the game was so tough and so different. Like,
right. Yeah.
and you know, they're riding 10, 12 players. It's at certain points.
Right.
Two goalies who can barely make it through a game without getting hurt.
Yeah.
People running
Yeah.
them over. Aaron high sticks.
Yeah,
I mean,
of course.
Of course. But yeah, today's game is so much different. I mean, the grind is obviously longer. You got to win 16 games for the cup, and the season's a bit longer. But to be honest, the players are so well taken care of. There's so much treatment. They're so healthy. They're so fit. They're not members of parliament during the day.
No, they're not members of parliament.
So I mean,
most of them, I assume, aren't smoking.
No, they're not smoking on the bench.
I don't. Yeah.
So just really different. To be honest,
just different.
It might be closer than you might think, because initially you might think, oh, they play so many less games.
Right.
But when you dig a little deeper
games,
there, it might be a little more equal than we thought. So, Terry, it's pretty fitting that the finals of the original 6 era was between Montreal and Toronto, wasn't it?
Yeah, and in more ways than one, Chris. 1967 was Canada's centennial, and Expo 67, the World's Fair, was being held in Montreal. The Canadiens had a space reserved in the Quebec Pavilion to display the Stanley Cup. The last time the NHL expanded or contracted was 1942, when the Brooklyn Americans folded. 1967-68 would bring 6 new teams, 125 more jobs, 2 divisions, and 12 games needed to win the cup. Teams would be able to protect 10 skaters and 1 goalie. The direct sponsorship of junior teams by the NHL was to be phased out in the upcoming year, and no new sponsored players could be registered or required to sign a contract restricting movement between teams, paving the way for the full amateur draft. Now, this would negate the great territorial advantage held by the Leafs and the Habs. Mm-hmm. Also, the Players' Union, an idea that players like Ted Lindsay and Doug Harvey fought for in the 1950s, would be certified in June 1967. Ironically, the first 2 presidents of the NHLPA were from the stridently anti-union Leafs. So, before the expansion era begins, we have one more final between the 2 most successful franchises in NHL history. And the 2 teams were not dissimilar. That year, Montreal was looking for a three-peat and were led by veterans Jean Beliveau and Henri Richard. But youngsters like Jacques Laperrière and Yvan Cormier were starting to assert themselves. Like Toronto, they had 2 future Hall of Famers in net, with veteran Gump Worsley and rookie Rogie Vachon. Mm-hmm. 7 players were over 30, and Coach Toe Blake and company were happy to draw Toronto, who they swept the year before in the semis, and home ice advantage, and not the first place Chicago team. So at this moment, Montreal has 14 cups, Toronto has 12. So history diverges here, Chris.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, just the whole way it happened, these 2 teams meeting up in the finals, incredible.
And it was close at that time, but again, as we know, Montreal goes on.
Yeah, it's the closest it gets. It's the closest it gets.
Yes,
the last time it was this close.
Right, and Montreal was able to get over the loss of the territorial advantage.
Yeah.
Again, a lot, I guess, goes down to Sam Pollock, the GM in Montreal. Mm-hmm. And they win 8 cups between 68 and 79.
Right.
And then 2 more after that. Right. So they were able to continue to have success. And we'll talk a little later about why maybe the Leafs went off the rails for the immediate future.
That's going to be interesting to hear, because I mean they were neck and neck to this point.
They were neck and neck. Yeah, that's right. But again, today it's not what it's not what Montreal did right. We'll see what Toronto did wrong initially, and what's going on now. Like I say, I don't know if anyone can explain the last few years, but before that though, before the Leafs, get down, it's time for talk about the glory.
Yeah, let's get right into the finals here. So we got Habs Leafs 1967. Terry, take us through it.
That's it. Game one was April 20th, 1967, at the Forum in Montreal, and the rested Habs cruised 6-2. With Johnny Bower replacing Terry Sawchuk for the last period. Punch Imlach was calling Rogie Vachon a junior B goalie before the game. Captain George Armstrong returned for Toronto, and defenseman Larry Hillman would score his only goal of the playoffs. Larry Hillman is the youngest player to have his name on the Stanley Cup. He was 18 years, 2 months when the Red Wings won in 1955. And Chris, that's a record that will never be broken, because today a player must be 18 on September 15th to play in the NHL. So that's never being broken. Yeah. Hillman would win another cup in 68 with Montreal after being run out of town by Punch Imlach's parsimony. And we'll talk more about that later. While Hillman would play all 12 games of the playoffs, game one would be the only game Ott Eriksson played for the Leafs all year. The 29-year-old defenseman was called up from the Victoria Maple Leafs and would get his name on the score sheet when he served a bench penalty for too many men. He would go on to play for the Oakland Seals. Milan Marcetta was the other call-up from Victoria that would see action for the Leafs in the playoffs. The 30-year-old center was the leading scorer in Victoria and would appear in 3 playoff games. He would later become an original Minnesota North Star. A couple of much bigger names, though, were in Punch Imlach's doghouse and were therefore marginalized during this cup run. Bobby Baun was 30. The Toronto Marlies product was a hard-hitting defenseman who debuted with the Leafs in 1956 and entered Leafs lore with his heroics in the 1964 Cup final versus Detroit. In Game 6 that year, Baun blocked a Gordie Howe slap shot in the third. He was stretchered off, had his leg frozen, and returned to beat Terry Sawchuk in overtime to tie the series at 3. Baun would play Game 7 on the broken leg as the Leafs won another cup.
I remember hearing that story as a kid. Just incredible.
Yeah, indeed. Eh? So 3 years later, unfortunately, 3 years later, his relationship with Imlach had deteriorated to the point where he would skip the Leafs victory party and parade. Again, the dispute was over money. Baun was a staunch union guy. He was the second president of the NHLPA. Another former stalwart who found himself playing fourth-line minutes was Eddie the Entertainer Shack. Mm-hmm. The Sudbury native, a prototypical pest and fan favorite, was also 30 that year and had played on the other 3 Leaf Cup teams of the 1960s. He scored the Cup-winning goal in 1963. He'd be traded that offseason, but would return to the team in the mid-1970s and would remain an extremely popular figure in Toronto until his death in 2020. Did you get a chance to listen to the song I sent you, Chris?
I can't remember.
Here, clear the track. Here comes Shaq.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I can't. Yeah, I remember. So I can't remember who wrote it though.
Oh, it's Brian McFarlane.
Brian McFarlane.
The noted hockey writer.
Yeah,
and someone Douglas Rankine and the Secrets. A little one-hit wonder novelty tune about Eddie Shack, right?
He's not stomping Tom with the songwriting, but definitely clever. Definitely clever.
Yeah, of course.
It
goes again. Eddie Shack was very much the everyman.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, the everyman. Not the most talented guy in the world, but a great hard worker. Do you remember the Pop Shop?
No.
Oh, man, I got to talk to your dad. I tell you, yeah, you don't remember the Pop Shop? No. Anyhow, yeah, he had a donut chain too. Eddie Shack.
I know that again. He had his fingers in a lot of cookie jars.
Yeah, is exactly right. And again, along with Johnny Bower, one of the long-standing favorite amongst all Leaf fans, right? Just a quick note: the rule is still the same. Ott Eriksson and Milan Marcetta got their name on the Stanley Cup. If you play 41 games in the regular season or 1 game in the finals, you're eligible to have your name put on the cup, and the team is allowed to put up to 52 names.
And
So
that's still the rule today.
that's still the rule. So
Okay.
if you play 41 in the regular
Half of the
season
regular season.
or one in the finals,
Right. So
then
there's
you're
been,
eligible.
yeah, okay. So the Stammer coming back for one game makes sense. And
Uh,
like,
Right.
I mean,
Right.
could you imagine if, I mean, there's been such weird things that happen, but guys say, play 35 games in the regular season, play the first 3 rounds of the playoffs,
Don't get
get an injury and don't get on the cup. Pretty sad.
that's it, man. Yeah.
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 All right. So let's get back to this, Terry. So just like in the semis in Chicago, the Leafs rebounded for a win in game 2.
Yeah. And they would do it in punch Imlach Leaf style. That is defense first and foremost. Johnny Bower turning away 31 shots for a 3-0 shutout. Imlach told reporters after the game that Rogie Vachon, he was now playing like a junior A goalie.
Okay.
That being said, Jim Pappen had his 10th point in 8 playoff games for the Leafs game to win. Pappen was 27. The former Toronto Marley was a rookie on the cup-winning team of 64 and would lead the team in scoring in these playoffs with 7 goals, 8 assists, 15 points. He would also be run out of town by Punch Imlach, going to Chicago, where he had some good years with some good Blackhawk teams before retiring in 1975. Chris, can you imagine a coach, trash talking like that today? Calling the other team's goalie saying he's junior B.
Those are finable offenses. No coach wants to pay those fines. No, there seems to be a lot less of that.
Right.
When you look back at calling somebody a junior B goalie, those are things that you might see come out in the papers that maybe a player said behind the scenes.
Right.
Nobody's coming out like quoting themselves and saying that in the newspapers.
Yeah, there's that kind of psychological advantage. They go about it a little different now. I think you're right.
Yeah, with a little, they still like to throw little
sure.
jabs like that, but they're just a little smarter about it.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now game 3 was back in Toronto. John Ferguson tied it with a minute to go for Montreal, but Toronto would prevail 3-2 in double overtime on a 61 save performance by Johnny Bower. This would be his last action of the playoffs. And a goal by future Hall of Famer Bob Pulford, class of 1991. Pulford was 30, a Marlies product who played for the Leafs from 55 to 72, but is also remembered for his nearly 30-year career as coach GM of the Chicago Blackhawks. Pulford was also the first president of the NHLPA. A tenacious forechecker, that was his only goal of the playoffs, though he would add 10 assists to finish third on the team in scoring. Now, Pulford's a Hall of Famer and went to the front office, but nowhere near the player that current cup holder, Hall of Famer GM Joe Sakic was. And Chris, what skills are there the same skills or different skills that allow someone like to make that post-playing leap?
Well, to be honest, Terry, when you think about it, there haven't been many that have done it. There have been some attempts. Stevie Yzerman recently, obviously.
Right.
Patrick Waugh, who, not coaching in the NHL, coaching junior hockey.
Right.
To me, you got to be a real special. I mean, not many guys have the smarts of seeing those parts of the game. Most players are so focused on, improving themselves and being an amazing hockey player. There's only a few guys that see the game from a different perspective. I think obviously Joe Sakic's definitely one of those guys. And if you talk to anybody about him as a player, they're going to say the same things. Just so smart, so intelligent, saw the game differently than most, saw things 2 or 3 plays ahead of guys. It's things you only hear about real special players. And I would say Stevie is probably another one.
Yeah, I think too, maybe the better you are at it, maybe they just have the tendency to say, just go do what I did.
Yeah.
Exactly.
What do you mean?
I do this when I just, like walking into the rink. So ability to.
I also think there's a fear there. There's a lot of players that could probably do it, but don't do it out of the fear of not being great at it. So if you're
another very good point.
If you're a Hall of Fame hockey player and then you suck at being a GM,
That's right.
You don't
What
you don't
are
want
you remembered for? Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. Good point. Again. Yep.
Yeah. So back to the action. Just like the Chicago series, the Leafs come up small in game 4.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. The Habs rolled
Oh,
to a
sorry,
6-2.
Terry. Sorry to interrupt
Oh,
you there for a sec.
yeah, certainly.
You mentioned the 61 save performance by Johnny Bower being his
Right.
last. Are you going to
Yes.
explain what happened there? We're going to get to that.
Again, that was I think that was the only the game to go into to overtime as well, right?
Yeah.
And again, he just came back. One
Gassed.
thing you have to, yeah, gassed, and I mean, the man was remember, man, the man was 42.
40. Yeah.
He was 42.
Right.
So Imlach went with the youngster at 37,
Yeah.
Sawchuk,
Sawchuk. Yeah.
right? And one thing, you will, I think you have to give Imlach credit is that going back and forth, right? Maybe the guys today, boy, that's if you're leaving yourself open
Mm-hmm.
to, second guessing if you don't ride the hot hand.
Right.
And so Imlach, to his credit, he showed, no problem going back and forth, right? Whoever he thought was looking better for, he'd go with it.
Right.
Yeah. And again, it was, sorry, lad, you got me lost there. Yeah.
No worries.
So,
No worries.
that's right. So, game 4. So the Habs rolled,
Yeah.
6-2.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The Leafs continued to get production up and down the line, though, as young Pete Stamkowski got his 11th point in 10 playoff games.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Stamkowski, a former Marley, was 23. A great face-off man. This was his last year in Toronto. He would be part of the disastrous Frank Mahovlich trade with Detroit in 1968 and go on to some good years in the 1970s on some good New York Ranger teams. Despite the loss, the Leafs liked where they stood after 4 games. And in Game 5 in Montreal, the veterans stepped up with a decisive 4-1 win. Sawchuk was sharp, while Horton, Kelly, Keon, and Mahovlich all had points. The Leafs' third goal was by Marcel Pronovo. His unassisted effort was his only point of the playoffs. The 36-year-old defensive stalwart came to the Leafs in 1965 after starting his Hall of Fame career in Detroit, and we met him, Terry Sawchuk's best friend, when we watched the Sawchuk movie. And this was Pronovo's last hurrah. He would play 40 more games over the next 2 years and then retire. Also, as I mentioned last time, Chris, he would get his name on the Stanley Cup 3 more times as a scout for the New Jersey Devils. Mm-hmm. And it was 53 years between the first time his name went on the Stanley Cup and the last time that his name went on the Stanley Cup. That is impressive.
That's very impressive.
It is. And so, Chris, this leaves the Toronto Maple Leafs 1 win away from winning the Stanley Cup. Could you imagine, or tell me now, what you think that scenario would look like today?
Oh man, the players would be sweating their butts off before they even leave the dressing room. I mean, there's so much pressure on these guys right now. I can't even imagine. Like, I just think back to a few years ago when, I think we might talk about this a little bit later with some of the series where they even to get to the finals. The pressure, it just seems insurmountable at this point. Whatever it is, it's the curse, or whatever you want to call it, the demons, the ghosts of Christmas past, whatever you want to call it. It's just bad. And I don't know, man. I just can't imagine if the Leafs are 1 win away from the Stanley Cup, the entire country of Canada will be on the edge of their seats. Just
again,
I can't imagine. I can't. I hope it. I pray that it happens in my lifetime, Terry.
Again, you're a very good point, Chris. Yeah. We'll. I don't know if I ever want to see it in my lifetime, but again, no doubt it'd be good for the game. It'd be good for the game because I mean that's the sort of event that would generate interest from non-fans or casual fans.
Right.
It'd bring out the haters.
Yeah.
Right. It'd transcend the sport. Right. Agreed. There'd be op-eds about national identity, and back in the day, you'd hear all about what we're talking about here tonight.
Yeah.
And professional sports are narrative driven. Mm-hmm. I mean, you need it more than ever when inevitably sports today, whatever the sport, it comes down to is money. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's money. That's the only thing that we seem to be concerned about. So if something like this does occur, right, it takes the focus way back onto a different people be looking at it from a whole different level.
I can't even imagine what it would cost or how much money they would make in a Stanley Cup Finals.
Yes. Now, and that's a nice segue, Chris, because speaking of money, face value of the top ticket that day at Maple Leaf Gardens was $7.
$7.
It was $7.
Oh my gosh!
I'm sure it was going for a little more on the black market. Before Game 6, Punch Imlach laid out $3,000 in $1 bills on the dressing room floor. A reminder of what each player could earn with another win over the Habs. The total bonus was over $5,000 a player, and for some of the younger players, that would be a 50% bump in their salary. In 2019, winners got around $200,000, but with the minimum at $750,000, it's a smaller percentage.
Okay.
And again, Chris, one thing I think you have to realize is players can afford to say it's not about the money now. Mm-hmm. It's easy to say it's not about the money when you've already got the money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
So, and again, Frank Mahovlich led the team in salary that year at $32,000. And Chris, it's money that will help explain the next 25 years of the Maple Leafs franchise. After that, it's curses or jinxes or some weird metaphysical reckoning. I'm not sure, but and again, what do you think a ticket would go for at a clincher today?
Oh my gosh, I bet you're looking at $500,000 for a front row seat. Like, I would not be surprised, but it'd be in the hundreds of thousands, no question.
Man, the mind reels. It really does.
There'd be no limit. There'd be some wacko that'd be willing to pay $500,000 to go watch that game. I mean,
I'll tell you,
God bless him, because
a win is.
They better break the curse. Yeah, the win is not guaranteed.
The win is not guaranteed.
But before all that happened, Terry, we still got Game 6 here.
There's Game 6.
Yep.
Yeah, and on May 2nd, 1967, the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup with a 3-1 win over their arch rival Montreal Canadiens. Jim Pappen scored the cup-winning goal. It was originally announced as Pete Stemkowski, but later ruled that it went in off Hab defenseman Terry Harper. Pappen earned a bonus as the leading goal scorer in the playoffs, and he and Stemkowski would jokingly argue for years after about who actually scored it.
Yeah.
George Armstrong would add an empty netter, the last goal scored in the original 6 era.
Wow.
The Leaf captain then accepted the trophy from Commissioner Clarence Campbell, and after a 5-minute celebration on ice, the team headed to the dressing room for a celebration and an uncertain future. And very much unlike today's circus, Chris.
Oh my goodness!
After it's over,
it's a month of, well, if you're Alex Ovechkin or Brett Hall, it's like 3 months of partying. But everything is amped up and hyped to the extreme now.
Even just on the ice, they were on the ice for 5 minutes, skated around once.
Yeah.
And off we go, right?
No, Now it's the families, the cousins, everyone's getting a picture.
Of course. Yeah. It's you gotta get it for the gram.
Get it for the
media.
That's right, bud.
That's exactly it. Yeah.
So I mean, obviously that was the fact that you just read the Toronto Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup in a sentence was kind of shocking. But afterwards, obviously this was the peak. This was the end of that era. And now the decline begins.
The decline begins, Chris. And
and
with the front office increasingly distracted by a criminal conspiracy of their own making, Punch Imlach went about cementing his reputation with the Leafs for good coach, poor GM. Starting by protecting the 42-year-old Bauer and 37-year-old Pronovo in the expansion draft. By the time Stafford Smythe fired him in 1969, only a handful of Leafs from their last championship team remained. The rest had retired or were run out of town for union activities, Pulford, Bond, personal vendettas, Mahovlich, Stemkowski, or cheapness, Hillman, Pappen. No original six team was as anti-union as Toronto, and no team did a poorer job adapting to the end of the sponsorship system. The St. Michael's Marlies pipeline was gone, and in 1968, the front office sold off their minor league franchises in Victoria and Rochester. Also, they didn't draft well. In 1969, they chose a guy named Ernie Moser over a guy named Bobby Clark. Now, while every team misses, every team misses sometimes, right?
Yeah.
And the Leafs would feature some great players in the years to come. The aforementioned Borje Salming and the others that we talked about. No Toronto Maple Leaf draft pick from 1967 to 2002 would win a major NHL individual award or, as a Maple Leaf, the Stanley Cup.
That's 35 years. That's incredible. I mean, what a chain of events. I mean, you would think a team that's had so much success in the past would have understood what it takes to win, and that's that pedigree. It's that core group of guys. I mean, you can't starting old, like they basically started over. And criminal conspiracy.
I think this has a lot to do with it.
Okay.
Yeah. The Stanley Cup run of 1966-67 was extremely important to owners Stafford Smythe and Harold Ballard. John Bassett was more of a silent partner. He was eventually forced out by Smythe and Ballard. The two playoff rounds meant an infusion of sorely needed cash because by 1967, despite booming business and expansion to Maple Leaf Gardens, Smythe and Ballard were leveraged on loans, cheating on taxes, and skimming money off the Leafs and the Marlies to pay their personal expenses. They were making more money off the Marlies. There would be smaller crowds, but the hockey team was extremely popular. And you only had to pay junior players $60 a week.
Right.
Conn Smythe had sold his shares in 1961, but remained as an advisor until 1966, when he resigned in disgust, saying the organization was putting cash ahead of class, but hoping the team would stay in his family forever. This was not to be. In 1969, Stafford Smythe and Harold Ballard were charged with fraud and tax evasion. Stafford Smythe, his erratic behavior exacerbated by alcoholism, would die of a bleeding ulcer at the age of 51, 2 weeks before the trial began in October 1971, but not before making Harold Ballard executor of his will and including a codicil that said Ballard could buy his shares. The Smythe family would later contest this to no avail. In August 1972, Maple Leafs owner Harold Ballard would be found guilty of 48 of 50 charges against him and was sentenced to 9 years. He would be paroled in October of 73 to reign over a new era in Maple Leaf history. Now, had you ever heard that story, Chris?
No, not before seeing this here, Terry. I mean, what is all I can say? I mean, the fact that you can return from a 9-year prison sentence for all.
He did a year.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, come on.
But of course. And
these were some serious charges. This wasn't like you get a speeding ticket nowadays, you're probably in trouble with your team.
Right.
Yeah, no, this stuff wouldn't fly today. I'm big on second chances though, Terry.
You know, and as we'll see, Chris, a lot of bad, could be said about Conn Smythe.
Yeah.
But he was a hockey guy. He was a hockey guy first and foremost.
Right.
This new guy.
So take us through. Take us through the Ballard years.
Yeah, and here, Chris, the Ballard years. Here is where maybe we should have a trigger warning for Leaf fans.
Yeah.
Harold Ballard he's what we now call a troll, right? He owned the Hamilton Tiger Cats in the CFL, and he had their logo painted on center ice at Maple Leaf Gardens until the league ordered him to stop. When players' names became mandatory on the back of the jerseys, that was an innovation brought in from the WHA.
Mm-hmm.
Ballard, he was infuriated that sales of game day programs would suffer. So he had the names put on in blue on the blue sweaters and put on in white on the whites. Right. Again, the league had to intervene.
Yeah.
Right. Ballard sold the Leafs championship banners and ordered the burning of Foster Hewitt's broadcasting gondola, despite entreaties from the Hall of Fame. His treatment of players was abhorrent. Too cheap to compete with WHA salaries, his low ball offers drove Bernie Parent and Paul Henderson to the rival league. Henderson told Ballard to take his contract offer and stick it up his. He solved his feud with Captain Darryl Sittler, who he called a cancer and who had a no trade clause, by trading Sittler's friend and line mate Lanny McDonald to the Colorado Rockies. Most egregious was driving away the franchise icon Dave Keon. Ballard wouldn't give Keon a much-deserved raise, then asked for a ridiculous amount in trade, forcing Keon to the WHA. Ballard would be dead for 20 years before Keon reconciled with the team.
Wow.
Oh, and in 1979, Ballard fired coach Roger Nielsen, couldn't find anyone to take the job, rehired Nielsen, and tried to make him wear a paper bag over his head on the bench so he could be the mystery coach. You're sensing a pattern here, Chris.
Yeah, just failure. That's the pattern.
Yeah, indeed. Yes. Yeah. And again, some of it may be a little funny in retrospect, right? But much of it is sad. And I think especially his dealings with people.
Yeah.
And it seems like he resented the Smythe success.
Mm-hmm.
And once he realized the cost of replicating it, I think he decided he'd just be as happy burning it to the ground.
That's a good point, and you're probably right.
Yeah,
you're probably right.
Right, and so now, Chris, these are the Leafs of your youth.
Yeah.
How do you remember the Leafs?
Well,
as a kid,
the Leafs were terrible. I mean, I was born in the early '80s. The Leafs were bad all throughout the '80s. I think they had like one 500 season in the early '90s. They had one decent season. But other than that, I just remember them being bad. And like when you're a kid, you kind of like people often like follow the teams that are winning, when you're young. It's my dad's a Leafs fan. I'm a Habs fan. I remember being a kid and be like, I can't believe my dad likes the Leafs. Like they're so bad. Like they're such a they're the worst team. Like
right,
why would he like them? Obviously, I learned that throughout the years.
When he was your age.
Yeah, exactly. I did learn that throughout the years of why he loves the Leafs. But I just remember them being bad, and I just remember all the heartbreaks, all the close calls. Of course, '93. Just seems like 35 years without having a guy win an NHL award. Like I saw the end of that era. So not a quality hockey team.
No, and the numbers unfortunately bear that out.
Yeah.
Again, the Leafs of my youth, a few years before that, they were just equally as rotten. and Harold Ballard was the very definition of a meddlesome owner.
Right.
In the 18 years between 1972 and 1990, he hired and fired 13 coaches and 6 GMs. He made himself GM when Punch Imlach returned and suffered 2 heart attacks. The team never finished higher than 3rd in its division. From 1979 to 92, they had one season at 500.
Right.
But because 16 of the 21 teams made the playoffs, that was an appeasement to the teams that had come in from the WHA.
Yeah.
They made the playoffs 7 times, never getting past the second round. In 1978, Ballard demanded Bob Davidson take a massive pay cut. Davidson, a former Leafs captain who's been called the father of modern scouting. He was the architect of the Marley's Mike's pipeline with some 200 bird dogs around the country, who had a knack of appealing to any parent. He rightfully walked away, and that left the team in even further disarray. Ballard died in 1990, leaving his estate to a charitable trust. He referred to his 3 children as reptiles and cut them out of his will.
Wow.
Toronto businessman Steve Stavro was executor of Ballard's will. And he, with the help of current chairman Larry Tannenbaum and the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, they would make the team a private company, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment Limited. They would buy the Toronto Raptors of the NBA and build the Air Canada Centre, now Scotiabank Arena. However, Chris, whether the owners were idiosyncratic dictators like Smythe or Ballard, or faceless bureaucrats like MLS and ELTD, one thing remains constant about the Toronto Maple Leafs: the fans show up in droves,
Mhm.
which is admirable, right? Or is it like watching a friend in a toxic codependent relationship?
Well, that is a tough question, but the answer is it's like watching a friend in a toxic relationship. No, I'm
No,
just kidding, just
it's
kidding.
great, right?
No,
Yeah,
it is,
it is great.
it's admirable.
It is.
I to me though, the thing that kind of takes me a little bit away from that is that like you can be a fan of a team, but you got to be a fan of the sport, number one. And then you can be
Yeah,
a fan of the team. But these diehard fans, it's what makes the sport a little bit special. Like it kind of sets things apart for me. And I mean, you can say it about most sports, but the original
yeah,
six, especially, the franchises that have been around the longest, obviously have earned that right to have these diehard fans. And I mean, there's a
yeah.
reason the Leafs are the richest team. Um, their fans are
They're the center of
diehard.
it.
Everybody, they've
Yeah,
always been in the center of it. I mean,
yeah, that's
and
right.
and it's yeah, I think it's fitting. It's definitely fitting.
Yeah, yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've seen, again, the Leafs, they were due for a downturn
Mhm.
after that last championship,
Yeah.
right? It was
Yeah.
an older team, and then chaos happened to roll into town. It was that perfect storm sort of thing. But Chris, they remain in the woods, right? The team has not returned to, let alone won a Stanley Cup since the finals since 1967. So I ask you now,
Mhm.
do you believe in curses?
No, to be honest, no. But there, it's hard to explain for me because I don't think someone could put a curse, but I do believe that people can be cursed. Or if,
Mm-hmm.
like and it's not, I don't think cursed is the right word, but I do think that, when there's so much history of failure and so many bad things that have happened, the players that are in the current situation are the ones dealing with it. And
Yeah,
they're squeezing their sticks a little tight. They're losing focus for a minute, letting emotions run wild. Like there's just so many little factors. And I mean, as
yeah,
as the snowball turns, it just keeps getting bigger. So
indeed.
eventually something's gonna have to give here for the Leafs. And I hope
Right.
like I said, it's gonna happen, but it's gonna take a special group. It's gonna take a
Yep.
special leader. It's gonna take
Yeah.
something really, really special is going to happen to get them over that hump. So getting over the
Yeah.
hump, whether you want to call it a curse or not, I don't know if it's the right word or the right term,
Right.
because I think there's just so many factors.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, very, very, yeah, very well put. There's no such thing as curse.
Yeah.
I'm a Red Sox fan. I'm a Red Sox. There's no Babe Ruth curse, man. Ask Cubs fans. There was no curse of Billy
That's
Goat,
right.
right?
I mean,
Again, Chris. You could look at it now. Are all Canadian teams cursed?
well, it's been a while. I mean,
Yeah. The Leafs have they have company in the in this department, right?
in the
In
drought
the lack of
department.
champion,
Yeah, the drought
in the
department.
drought department. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah, but Chris, if we do entertain the notion
yeah.
that the Leafs are cursed,
Mm-hmm.
who or what is cursing them?
Go.
So yeah, some date it back to the Mahovlich trade in 1968. Some say it's the number 13. The team is stuck on 13 titles, and May 13th, 2013 was the date of the most infamous Leafs loss of this century. I'm sure Paul would be happy to talk about that one all day.
I knew this was
Yeah,
coming.
right.
Yeah.
Is it, Chris? Is it the ghost of Harold Ballard? Bill Ballard, son of Harold, who ran the team while his father was in prison,
Mm-hmm.
said his father once told him that he would run the team from his grave. And like the Magic 8 Ball says, all signs point to yes. Many believed in the Hillman hex. Larry Hillman had a good playoff that year for the 67 Leafs and asked Punch Imlach for a $5,000 raise in order to bring his salary up to $20,000. Imlach refused, which prompted Hillman to hold out from joining the team the following season until he was given the raise he believed he'd earned. In retribution, Imlach fined Hillman $100 a day for each day of his 24-day holdout. Hillman was forced to pay the team $2,400 and in 1969 moved on to play for Montreal. But upon leaving Toronto, he hexed the franchise, saying until the day they repaid him with interest, they would not win the Stanley Cup. Hillman, who this past June, only died this past June in Sudbury at the age of 85. He chose to lift the curse in 2017 after Leafs president Brendan Shanahan repaid Hillman the $2,400 plus 50 years interest. The Leafs would lose in the first round that year. Yeah, but wow. Good on Shanahan. Yeah, good on him.
I mean,
that's a good move. Yeah, because moves like that.
Yep.
Yeah, and again, moves like that, and retiring the numbers of past greats, not honoring them that they'd done a while, and that was a move the franchise made in its centennial year of 2016, and that brought Keon back into the fold. You know, that shows respect for the past. That might help rewrite the future.
Yeah.
So love them or hate them, Chris.
Yeah.
They are showing signs of finally putting it all together. So is this the year that they get it done?
Well, first of all, obviously Brendan Shanahan believes in curses. No, it's not the year they get it done, Terry. I still don't think this team has a core identity. It's gonna take a few years of winning with a core group. They gotta. I still don't think there's questions in goal. There's questions about their toughness. Every time they lose a few games, they're going to fire their head coach. There's just too much. I don't think they're ready to get over that hump yet. I'm sorry, Paul. I don't think that the curse is over yet. I don't think that the first pitch by Austin Matthews is going to break the curse.
It was enough.
I really don't. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a talented team.
Yeah.
But they don't have that identity. Like, to me, when I look at a winning team from the last, if you look at the Penguins teams, you look at the Bruins, you look at the LA Kings, the teams that have been able to, dominate for a period of time, there's been a core group of guys there for a period of time together. There's no questions in goal. They've got a number one goaltender that's been there, and that, I mean, mind you, the Penguins went through a period there with Murray and Fleury, but when Murray took over, he just went with it. But when you've got question marks in goal, I just don't think they're ready, Terry. I honestly don't.
Yeah.
I think they need to figure out what this team is going to be, how they're going to win. Some nights you'll see a game that's 7-2, and the next night it's 2-1. Are they a close scoring team? Low scoring team? Are they a high scoring team? What kind of game are they playing right now? I don't even know.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Oh God, I hope not. Right. I mean, and hey, there was very little Schadenfreude here today. I thought we treated the Leafs with respect.
The respect. Yeah.
With respect, and again, we didn't take too many cheap shots. No. But no, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to lie to you and say I want the Leafs to win the cup.
Yeah.
No.
Could they though? I know you don't want.
Again,
do you think they have the talent?
And it's nice to see that they are trending in the right direction, as you said.
Yeah.
A healthy Maple Leafs team is, again, good for the game.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea, I don't wish them to go back to like the Ballard years. Mm-hmm. Right. I don't wish that on anybody. Right. Especially people who are that invested in it.
Right.
Right. So, I'm happy where they are. And, the Islanders already beat them this year. So,
you're happy.
That's, we beat them. So there you go.
I'll tell you one thing. It won't be the Habs or the Islanders winning the cup this year.
I'm afraid I probably not. No, probably not. Probably not at the end.
I'll put my bank account on that one.
Yeah, I'm afraid you're right.
Yeah. All right, Tara, take us home, buddy.
Yeah. So to sum it all up, that was the 1966-1967 Stanley Cup champion, Toronto Maple Leafs, a team that, unbeknownst at the time, marked a turning point in the franchise's history. From iconic teams of mostly homegrown heroes, who for the first 50 years of the National Hockey League ran neck and neck with Montreal for titles and influence, to teams derailed by epic mismanagement and an inability to change with the times, to the current iteration, a team that is trending upward but still, for reasons internal or existential, cannot make its way back to the Stanley Cup. And in one way, a clock is ticking. Every 13 years, the NHL removes the top band of the Stanley Cup to make way for new champions. That band is then displayed in the Hall of Fame. In 2031, teams from 1965-66 to 1977-78 will come off the cup, removing tangible evidence of the Toronto Maple Leafs Hockey Club from the sport's iconic trophy, rendering them ghosts of the game's glorious past.
Unbelievable, Terry.
All right, thanks, man.
As usual,
Hi.
just an incredible story with so many details. I'm gonna have to go back and listen to this again. Just so many different things to think about. So much history.
Great dude again.
Such a great history of a team and franchise. And Terry, as much as we may not be rooting for them, there's a little part of my heart that wants to see the Maple Leafs lift that cup again.
Yeah, well, or at least be right there with it, right? Yeah, it'd be exciting, man. It sure would. And again, thanks always for the opportunity.
All right, my friend, folks, that's Across the Pond, and that's a wrap.
Thank you to our amazing sponsors, the China Hockey Group, Wheel Hub Asia, AccessoryHouseGlobal.com, Yardley Brothers Beer, and of course, Sunset Studio. Check us out on Facebook and Instagram at Across the Pond HK. Email us, send in your comments and questions to the show at any time at acrossthepondhk@gmail.com.